Well, hello. Today I'll be reading Wonderland, and we're going to pick up on page 23 with Mavis. While Mavis's mother chattered away in the front seat, telling Mrs. Tully about taking French cooking lessons at the YWCA with her cousin Elmira, who was in the Toyota commercial, Mavis told Rose about all the places they lived. And one time, we lived in a condo in Atlanta that had a jacuzzi in the bathroom, she said. But the landlord got mad because we had a dog. What'd you do? Rose asked. Gave the dog to my Uncle Jerry. Oh. Once we lived with this crazy lady named Trixie who saved everything, Mavis said, like used paper cups and empty soup cans. Really? And one time we lived over a Chinese restaurant and I got free fortune cookies. Rose's eyes grew wide. How many places have you lived? A bunch, but I might go live with my dad someday. Where does he live? In Tennessee with his mother. She leaned toward Rose and added, she's kind of mean, so that's a problem. Your grandmother? Mavis nodded. I was supposed to stay there all summer last year, but she made me leave early. Mavis was surprised to see Rose suddenly look a little sad. It was their very first day together as best friends, and already Rose felt bad about Mavis's mean grandmother. That was a good sign. As the Tully's car made its way up the interstate, Mavis ran her hand over the soft leather seats. Then she took off her flip-flops and wiggled her toes in the thick black carpet under her feet. There wasn't a speck of dust or a single crumb on that carpet. When Mavis's mother drove her boyfriend Mickey's car, the floor was always littered with moldy French fries and dirty napkins and gravel from the driveway. But then, when the transmission had gone, her mother had left the car on the side of the road, which made Mickey mad as all get out. He and her mother had hollered at each other, and 2 days later, Mavis was packing her duffel bag again. Before long, Mrs. Tully turned off the interstate and zigged and zagged until they reached a wrought iron gate across the road and a sign that read, Magnolia Estates. This is where you live? Mavis asked Rose. Rose nodded. Why is there a gate? But Rose didn't answer. She was waving to a gray-haired, whiskery-faced man in a small brick gatehouse. Who's that? Mavis asked. Mr. Duffy. Rose kept waving out the back window of the car as they drove into Magnolia Estates. He's really sad, she said. How come? His dog died. Rose looked down at her hands in her lap, and Mavis thought she was going to cry. What happened? Rose looked up. What do you mean? What happened to his dog? She just got old. Rose let out a little sigh. Mr. Duffy used to do magic tricks and play his kazoo and stuff, but he doesn't anymore. He never even wants to play checkers. Then we'll cheer him up, Mavis said. I've been trying. What have you tried? Well, I took him some blackberries, and I showed him a new card trick from a magic book I got at school. Mavis let out a little pfft. You gotta do more than that. Like what? I'll think of something. Mavis picked Rose's arm and added, trust me. Rose and Mavis tagged along while Mrs. Tully showed Miss Cheater around the house. Rose couldn't help but notice her mother's face each time Miss Cheater piped up with a comment. Dang, Miss Cheater said, motioning at silver trays and pitchers and bowls on the pantry shelf. That's a lot of polishing. You gotta be a rocket scientist to figure that out, she said, pointing to the knobs on the gas stove. But I'll get it, she added quickly. Check this out, May, she tugged on Mavis's arm. A laundry chute. Rose could tell her mother was getting irked. That was a word she used often at the supper table when she told Rose's father about her day. Someone had almost always irked her. So Rose asked Mavis if she'd like to go upstairs to her bedroom. Sure, Mavis said. Rose led Mavis up the winding staircase and down the hall to her room. Holy cannoli, Mavis said as she flopped onto Rose's bed. A canopy. Then she jumped up and ran over to Rose's closet and began to count the dresses, ending with a loud 17 and making bug eyes at Rose. Mavis darted around the room, touching and counting and thwacking her forehead and saying, Holy cannoli, a few more times. When the sound of Miss Jeter's voice echoed up the staircase from the dining room and twined around with Mavis's voice there in her bedroom, Rose suddenly realized how quiet their house usually was. It was especially quiet since her sister Grace had gone away to college last fall. Sometimes Rose went into Grace's room to touch her things. The white leather jewelry box with gold initials, the ceramic cat with a ribbon for a collar, the flower vase filled with bird feathers. It was boring at home without Grace, who was always so surprising. She would up and do the most unexpected things, like buy a ratty old motorbike with her babysitting money, or roller skate in the foyer with their mother's garden club was there. Once she had brought a boy named Rocky home for supper without even asking. She just sat right down at the dining room table and said, Pass the chicken, without even introducing him. He had talked about deer hunting the whole time and given Mrs. Tully a headache. Before Grace left for college, she'd given Rose the shiny silver dollar she'd found on the beach in Mobile one summer. Was there anyone else in the whole world who had found a silver dollar on the beach? Rose didn't think so. Grace had put the coin in Rose's palm and closed her fingers over it. Hold down the fort, Rosie, she had said. When Grace finally came home to visit at Thanksgiving, she had a hummingbird tattoo on her wrist. Rose thought it was beautiful, but her parents didn't. Grace had hurried back to school in a huff, and now she was spending the summer with her roommate's family on a lake in Maine. Rose was trying to hold down the fort, but it sure was hard without Grace. So, Mavis said, as she inspected Rose's books on the shelf under the window seat, since we're best friends, we should have a club. A club? Rose had never been in a club before, unless you counted the junior garden club her mother had made her join in 3rd grade. But she hadn't liked that club very much and had disappointed her mother when she dropped out after only a few meetings. What kind of club? She asked. You know, like a best friends club, Mavis said as she examined Rose's collection of china horses. Oh, okay. Rose wasn't too sure about letting Mavis handle her china horses, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she said, What will we do in the club? Mavis moved on to Rose's stuffed animals in the doll bed. Rose hoped Mavis didn't think the doll bed was too babyish like Amanda did. She was relieved when Mavis just ran her hand over each stuffed animal and gave the doll bed a little pat of approval. Well, for starters, Mavis said, we can think of ways to cheer up Mr. Duffy. Okay. Rose felt a tingle of excitement. Suddenly, things seemed a lot better in Magnolia Estates. Mavis. Well, it's not exactly the Ritz-Carlton, Mavis's mother said, dropping the suitcase on the bed. She opened the bureau drawers and peered into the closet and inspected the cupboards of the kitchenette. Heck, she said, it's barely even the Motel 6. Mavis liked the little apartment over the Tully's garage. Well, it wasn't really an apartment, more like just a room, but it had everything they needed. Beds and bureaus, a stove and a refrigerator, a closet and a bathroom. There were small ruffled pillows on the beds that matched the flowered curtains and the armchair in the corner. All the dishes in the kitchen cupboards matched, even the cereal bowls and the coffee mugs. And it was way better than her dad's house in Tennessee, where she had to sleep on the couch when she visited, and it smelled like mothballs and too many cats. Mavis had a good feeling about this place. She'd only been here one day and she already had a best friend and her own bureau. But Mavis's mother strolled around the room, examining things and grumbling. Some people get mansions, and the rest of us get one little old room. She turned on the tiny television on top of one of the bureaus. A soap opera came on. Two women were arguing about a man named Todd. "Well, at least the TV works," her mother said. "But a toaster oven would have been nice." She turned the television off and dropped onto the bed. This might have been a mistake. Oh, here we go again, Mavis thought. "Doesn't seem like a mistake to me," she said. "We don't have to pay 1 penny for this room. And the Tully's house is like a castle. It sure beats working at the Early Bird." The Early Bird Cafe was the last place her mother had worked, in Hadley, Georgia. She used to come home every afternoon and tell Mavis how those hillbillies who ate there didn't even know how to spell the word tip, much less leave one. Then she had gotten into an argument with some lady who complained about her fried eggs, so Mr. Harding, who owned the cafe, told her to leave. "I couldn't get out of that dump fast enough," she had told Mavis when she got home. Mavis could have made a list of all the good things about her mother working for the Tullys, like the central air conditioning and the shiny marble foyer, that huge vase of real flowers on the dining room table, the French doors that opened out to the patio, where the gardener watered the potted ferns on the rock wall along the walkway that led down to the biggest, greenest lawn Mavis had ever seen. But instead, Mavis said, "Rose is my new best friend." Her mother rolled her eyes and flopped back on the bed. Mavis went down the steps and into the garage to look around. She had never seen such a tidy garage. On shelves along one wall were large plastic trunks labeled with things like outdoor Christmas lights and covers for Adirondack chairs. On another wall, shovels and rakes and hose hung on pegs. In one corner was a pink bicycle with silver tassels on the handlebars, a red wagon with wooden sides, and a skateboard. Mavis loved riding skateboards. She used to have one at her father's house in Tennessee, but then her grandmother ran over it with her car and wouldn't buy her another one. "When you leave nice things in the driveway, you don't deserve to have nice things," she had said in that mean way of hers. Just then, Rose appeared in the doorway. "Do you want to meet Mr. Duffy?" she asked. "Sure. Can I use the skateboard?" I guess. Is it yours?" Rose nodded. "My Uncle AJ gave it to me, but I don't really know how to use it, and my mom doesn't want me to anyway." "Why not?" "Too dangerous," Rose said. "She won't even let me go barefoot. That's how you get ringworm." "I go barefoot all the time. Do I look like I've got ringworm?" She held out her arms for Rose to examine. Rose shook her head. Mavis grabbed the skateboard and headed toward the door of the garage. "Well," she said, "if I were you, I'd do it anyway." "Do what?" "Go barefoot." "You would?" "Sure," Mavis said. "It's summer. You're supposed to go barefoot in the summer." But Rose just looked down at her sandals. Then off they went to the gatehouse, Mavis riding the skateboard and Rose running along behind her, sandals slapping on the asphalt road. Henry. Somewhere in the woods, a very skinny dog lay curled up tightly on a bed of rotting leaves. The dog was white, with a large brown spot in the shape of Texas on his side. His nose was long and thin. His legs were long and thin. His tail was long and thin. Suddenly, he was awakened by a noise. Slapping noises and the whirring of wheels on the asphalt road. The skinny white dog stood up and cocked his head. Maybe he should follow the noises instead of hiding in the woods. But then again, maybe not. Maybe he should stay right here. So he sat in the leaves and let out a tiny whine as the slapping and whirring grew fainter and fainter. Rose. "This is Mavis," Rose said to Mr. Duffy. "Her mother is working for us now, and they moved into the apartment over our garage." Before Queenie died, Mr. Duffy would have said something like, "Well, hot dang, we should have a cupcake party," or "Glory day, ain't that nice?" But today he smiled, a half-hearted smile, and shuffled over to his beat-up desk chair, where he spent the day opening the gates for cars and trucks to drive in and out of Magnolia Estates. He dropped into the chair with a sigh. "That's nice," he said. "Why is there a gate?" Mavis asked, peering out of the little sliding window over Mr. Duffy's desk. To keep the riffraff out," he said, giving Rose a wink. Rose felt her cheeks grow hot. Riffraff was the word her mother used to describe the people who weren't allowed to come into Magnolia Estates. "Rose said you do magic tricks." Mavis pushed at her tangle of curls. "Want to see one I can do?" Mr. Duffy nodded, but Rose could tell he didn't care that much about Mavis's magic trick. "I used to be real good at it, but I haven't practiced in a while," Mavis said, pulling a penny out of her pocket. She closed her fingers over it and then waved her other hand dramatically and said, "Abracadabra, sis-boom-ba." Then she opened her hand, and there in the middle of her palm was the penny. Mavis said, "Dang," and stamped her foot, making the penny fall out of her hand. It bounced across the linoleum floor and settled right in the middle of Queenie's bed, beside Mr. Duffy's chair. The fluffy round dog bed with Queenie embroidered in blue. Rose and Mavis and Mr. Duffy stared at the penny. Rose could practically see Mr. Duffy's sadness hovering over him and then coming to life right there in the gatehouse. It flopped over the little television on the desk and snaked in and out of the coffee cups and newspapers and wrinkled paperback novels with cowboys on the covers. It climbed over the droopy begonia on the windowsill and wrapped around the coffee maker on the file cabinet. And just when Rose thought that sadness would gobble them up like Godzilla, she hurried over and scooped the penny off Queenie's bed. Then she stood there, breathing in the thick, awkward silence, until Mavis started jibber-jabbering about how she needed to practice that trick and how she did it perfectly in a school talent show last year. Rose tried to make her eyes stare down at her sandals, but instead they looked over at Queenie's water bowl in the corner. Then they looked at Queenie's leash hanging from a nail by the door. Then they glanced down under the desk at Queenie's dirty stuffed monkey with the squeaker torn out. "Don't look at Mr. Duffy," Rose told herself. But she did. Mr. Duffy's shoulders drooped, and his weathered hands lay limply in his lap. His thin gray hair stuck out every which way under his cap. Was this sad old man the same one who used to dance around the gatehouse whistling his made-up song, the boogie-woogie whistle dance? If Rose could do any magic trick in the world, she would bring Queenie back. She would say, "Abracadabra, sis-boom-ba," and there Queenie would be, curled up in the middle of her bed, with her chin resting on her toy monkey. Then she would sit out in the shade with Rose and Mr. Duffy and wait for them to give her a bite of bologna. She would stick her head out the window of Mr. Duffy's rusty old truck, her ears flapping in the breeze. She would chase squirrels gathering acorns beside the gatehouse and wag her tail as she watched the kids at the school bus stop. And she would not be old. But of course, Rose couldn't bring Queenie back, and Mr. Duffy was as sad as a person could be. Mavis, page 43. Mavis had been told about a gazillion times that she must not go inside the Tully's house unless she was invited. "Just because I'm in there making potato salad put in a sterling silver bowl doesn't mean you have a free admission ticket," her mother said. Then she mumbled something about crystal goblets she had to wash by hand and linen napkins she had to iron, and then added, "Well, la-di-da is what I think about that." She examined herself in the mirror on the closet door, patting her hair and then tying the apron Mrs. Tully had given her around her waist. "So," she said, turning to Mavis, "please don't do anything to make that woman any more irritable than she already is. We've only been here 2 days, and clearly the honeymoon is over." Mavis shrugged and headed outside, where Rose was waiting at the bottom of the apartment steps. "Where should we go?" Mavis asked. They were having their first club meeting today to talk about how to cheer up Mr. Duffy. "Oh, I know a good spot," Rose said. Mavis followed her through the hydrangea garden, up the flagstone path along the side of the house, down the winding driveway and across the street to a vacant lot. "Build your dream home here," read the sign in the middle of the lot. Beyond that, at the edge of the woods, a large pine tree had fallen. Rose sat on the tree trunk and said, "Is this a good place for a club meeting?" Mavis looked around. Clumps of blackberry bushes and wildflowers were peppered among the weeds and large patches of dry red dirt. Not the best place for a club meeting, but maybe she could find something better later. "I guess so," she said. Then she sat on the log next to Rose and said, "I'll be president and you be vice president." Rose nodded. Then they talked about things they could do for Mr. Duffy. Decorate the gatehouse with crepe paper streamers. Make cupcakes with sprinkles. Twirl batons. "What are y'all doing?" Mavis looked up to see a girl with hair the color of cantaloupe skipping toward them. "Nothing," Rose said, crossing her arms and turning red in the face. "Who are you?" Mavis asked the girl. "Amanda Sim." The girl tossed her cantaloupe hair over her shoulder and repeated, "What are y'all doing?" "Nothing," Rose said again. "Having a club meeting," Mavis said. "What kind of club?" "A best friends club. Want to join?" Then she felt the sharp jab of Rose's elbow in her side. Amanda's eyebrows arched up. "Do you live in Magnolia Estates?" she asked, plopping down on the tree trunk next to Mavis. Her skin was pale and covered with freckles, as if someone had sprinkled cinnamon on her. Mavis told Amanda about the little apartment over Rose's garage that she had moved into 2 days ago. "And y'all are already best friends?" "Yep," Mavis said. "Right, Rose?" Rose nodded. "So you want to join our club?" Mavis asked Amanda again. Then she felt another sharp jab of Rose's elbow in her side. "No, thanks," Amanda said. "Well, why not?" Then this freckled girl named Amanda told Mavis about the friends she had, girls who lived in the big houses in a Magnolia Estates and took gymnastics lessons and were on the swim team. She showed Mavis her beaded bracelet she had made at a sleepover the night before and told her about the tennis camp she was going to later in the summer. "All the girls in Magnolia Estates are going," she said. Then she glanced over at Rose and added, "Well, almost all." Mavis felt a twinge of envy. She'd been so happy to have one friend. Imagine having as many as Amanda did. Maybe if her mother would stay in Landry long enough, she could. "What do you even do in your club anyway?" Amanda asked. "Well, right now we're trying to think of ways to cheer up Mr. Duffy," Mavis said. "Right, Rose?" Amanda rolled her eyes. "Oh, brother," she said. "He's crazy." Suddenly, Rose jumped up, stalked across the vacant lot, and marched up the road toward her house, leaving Mavis staring gape-mouthed after her on the log beside Amanda. Rose. Page 48. Rose was not one to get mad very often, especially at her best friend. Not that she'd ever really had a best friend, besides Ida Scoggins, and she had never got mad at Ida Scoggins. But now she was mad at Mavis for asking Amanda to join their club yesterday. She was also mad at Amanda for saying that mean thing about Mr. Duffy. Rose's anger made her feel hot and heavy and dark and bad. Yesterday, Mavis had been her best friend. And now she was someone who wanted Amanda Sim to be in their best friend's club. Why would Mavis want that? It was true that Mavis didn't know about Amanda sticking gum in Rose's hair at church one time on purpose. And she didn't know that Amanda had told some kids at school that Rose used to wet the bed. Mavis didn't know that she and Amanda used to be friends, but now Amanda and those other girls whispered to one another right in front of her. But then maybe Mavis didn't really care about the club as much as Rose had thought she did. Maybe Mavis would rather go to the mall with Amanda. Well, that was fine. Rose would stay up here in her bedroom. She arranged her books in alphabetical order by author. She cut pictures of dogs out of magazines and glued them in a spiral notebook. She drew a hummingbird on her wrist with a pen and then tried to wipe it off, leaving a big blue smudge. Once or twice she went to the window and pressed her face against the glass to see if Mavis was in the yard. She tried to see the vacant lot across the street, but the roof of the front porch was in the way. She heard the steady hum of the vacuum cleaner downstairs. Rose jumped when her mother stepped into her room and said, "For heaven's sakes, Rose, what are you doing up here?" "Nothing." "Then go find something to do. Miss Jeter needs to get in here." "There isn't anything to do," Rose said. The very instant those words came out of her mouth, Rose wanted to take them back, gather them up like butterflies in a net. But it was too late. Now her mother was telling her all the things there were to do, starting with playing with Amanda Sim and ending with going up the street to see the new garden made by the Junior Garden Club. Rose plodded downstairs and out the front door. When she stepped out of the air-conditioned foyer and onto the porch, the Alabama heat felt thick and heavy. She gave Pete and Larry each a pat on the head and made her way slowly to the end of the driveway. She needed to talk to Mr. Duffy. But how was she going to get past the vacant lot where Mavis and Amanda were probably having a best friends club meeting? Or maybe they were doing gymnastics in Amanda's front yard with some other girls from Magnolia Estates. And even if she had made it to the gatehouse without them seeing her, Mr. Duffy might not feel like talking to her. He might not say, "Hey, Rose Petal," or "What's shakin', bacon?" He might not give her butterscotch lifesavers, or make up another funny story about how he lost the tip of his finger, or any of the other things he always did that made her feel better no matter what. Rose went back to the front porch and sat on the steps between Pete and Larry. She rested her chin on her knees and closed her eyes and let misery snuggle up beside her. She knew what her mother would say if she saw her sitting there. "Stop moping, Rose," she would say. But Rose didn't care. She moped. While she moped, a dragonfly flitted among the flowers in the garden beside the screened porch. The neighbor's fat, grumpy cat sauntered across the lawn, and from somewhere in the woods behind the houses across the street came the loud and mournful howl of a dog. Henry. Somewhere in the woods, someone reached a freckled arm through a wrought iron fence. Who do we know who has freckles? The dog backed away, his heart racing. Then that same someone whispered to him, soothing words that made his racing heart settle down. The whisper was calling him Henry, a name the dog had never heard before, trying to coax him out of the bushes, telling him everything would be okay. But when that whispering someone reached toward the bushes and tried to touch him, he turned and ran deeper into the woods. Mavis. When Rose had jumped off the log and stormed away up the street, not even stopping when Mavis called her name, Amanda had laughed. She told Mavis that Rose acted like a baby and wouldn't go to sleepovers. She told her that Mr. Duffy couldn't remember anybody's name and fell asleep in the gatehouse, and lots of people in Magnolia Estates were not very happy about that. Then Amanda had disappeared up the side of the road, leaving Mavis sitting alone on the tree trunk. That night, Mavis sat in the little apartment over the garage, feeling sorry for herself, while her mother complained about having to wash and iron curtains. "Who in the world even does that?" her mother said, rummaging through her purse for another piece of gum. Mavis wanted to tell her mother how bad she was feeling about Rose, but she didn't. Her mother was liable to say something mean about Rose, so she just sat there feeling sorrier by the minute. She'd only been in Landry for 3 days, and already her new best friend was mad at her. The next day, Mavis fixed herself half a peanut butter sandwich and ran down the apartment steps around front where Rose was sitting on the porch between those concrete lions. "Hey," she called to Rose. Rose stared at the ground and mumbled a very quiet, "Hey." Mavis ran over and sat on the porch next to her. "Want some of my sandwich?" she asked. Rose looked a little surprised and shrugged. "What's the matter?" Mavis said. "How come you left the club meeting?" Rose brushed something invisible off her shorts and shrugged. "Because of Amanda, right?" Mavis said. "Maybe." Mavis flapped a hand at her. "She can't be in our club." Rose's head shot up. "She can't?" "Nope." "How come?" "Because she's mean." Rose perked up. "Really?" Mavis nodded. "She said mean things about you and Mr. Duffy after you left." "She did?" Rose's shoulders slumped. Mavis's mind raced. Maybe she shouldn't have said that. "Let's go fix some lunch for Mr. Duffy," she said. "Come on." Then she ran off up the flagstone path along the side of the house, through the hydrangea garden, up the Tullys' back steps, and right on into their kitchen, with Rose running behind her. When Mavis burst into the kitchen, her mother looked up from the butcher block island with shiny copper pots hanging above it. "Mavis," she said, "what in the world?" She'd been chopping boiled eggs, and now she began to rant at Mavis about the rules she had already forgotten, while she waved the knife around in the air, sending pieces of egg flying in every direction. "We're going to take lunch up to Mr. Duffy," Mavis said. "No, ma'am," her mother said. "You are not." Mavis stomped her foot and was preparing to go on a tirade when Mrs. Tully walked into the kitchen. When she saw Mavis, she said, "Oh, my, well." "She was just leaving," Miss Jeter said, glaring at Mavis. "When will the egg salad be ready?" Mrs. Tully asked. "I have guests coming any minute now." Then she turned to Mavis and said, "Rose needs to have her lunch now." Then a most surprising thing happened. Rose lifted her chin and said, "Mavis and I are taking lunch up to Mr. Duffy." But then she added a quick, "Okay?" Mavis watched in delight as Rose didn't wait for an answer. She scurried around the kitchen, grabbing bread and cheese and chips, while her mother's face turned red with disapproval. Mavis's mother went back to chopping egg salad, slamming the knife hard against the butcher block. Bang, bang, bang. Then Rose and Mavis gathered everything into a grocery bag and hurried out the door. And that's the end of page 57, so I can't wait to see what happens next. See you later.